Hello, my name is Jorge Leal. I'm a cultural and urban historian who examines Latin American and US Latinx youth cultures and cultural expressions around rock latinoamericano or rock en español, which emerged as a Latin American music genre in the 1980s, and which by the 1990s it had become popular in Southern California, where an eager and an enterprising group of young women and men began to create their own distinct version of the genre, which I define as rock angelino. So in this presentation, I will be discussing the underground publications, magazines, and zines that constituted a print culture, which was essential part of this music scene. These publications were written, designed, and printed in Los Angeles and circulated in Southern California, the US-Mexico borderlands, and throughout several cities in Mexico and metropolises throughout Latin America. During the 1990s and well into the outs or the early 2000s, the first decade of 2000s, young Latina immigrants involved in rock angelino published and circulated dozens of publications in Spanish, written in Spanish, and sometimes written in Spanglish throughout Southern California and beyond. Latin American immigrants, along with US-born Latinos, Latinas, drew from oppositional writings, songs, and films created in Latin America during the previous decades, the 1970s and the 1980s, as their intellectual toolbox to create these publications. These were publications such as La Banda Elástica, La Neta, Retila, Revista ENG, Perdidos en la Línea, Pop, Rockera, Frontera, and Al Borde, among many others, which were published by resourceful writers, designers, photographers who employed plenty of creativity. This to supplement for the lack of material or financial resources. Also, this is an era right before the advent of the internet as a resource that was available for everyone. So imagine, how would it be to share ideas, recommendations for albums, and bands, films, books without the internet? I'm just trying to paint a picture of how this happened right before the advent of what we do every day. How do we share content without Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok? Well, for Latina immigrants in the 1980s who preferred to read in Spanish about music cultures that were not conveyed in mainstream magazines, these so-called underground publications were one of the ways to share and learn about music, fashion, politics, and literature from Latin America, in addition to emerging US Latinx cultural expression. The distribution of these magazines happened at different scales. Locally in Southern California within the music shows, by hand, regionally, in record stores, and transnationally, by mail or by people traveling with a stack of magazines delivering them to interested readers in Latin American cities. So this is an extension of the historical and contemporary connections between Los Angeles and Latin America, and how ideas, people, politics have moved in the past and present. Now, I want to discuss how this print culture fits within a music genre. As a music genre, Latin American rock and roll has long been associated as part of the so-called counterculture and also oppositional politics in different Latin American countries. In Southern California, the music and the articles printed in these publications that emerged within rock angelino were crucial for Latin American immigrants and US-born Latinx for the replenishment of their ethnic and cultural identities as US-born Latinx and as immigrants who understood themselves connected to contemporary Latin American culture and politics. In addition, these publications and cultural expressions created bridges of solidarity between Latinx of different national origins, citizenship, and legal migratory statuses to claim themselves also as part of Southern California at a tense moment of demographic change, economic restructuring, racial tensions, and anti-immigrant politics. Now, I think it's important to provide a structural context of the region and the time period being examined, where this print culture emanates. From the 1980s to the 1990s, the population of Southern California saw a decrease of white residents and the emergence of a non-white demographic majority, with Latinx being the largest non-white ethnic group. The rise of Latinx residents in LA County is a confluence of factors such as the increase of US-born Latinx, immigration from Mexico and Central America, generated in the case of Mexico by the implementation of neoliberal policies, in the case such as the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which transforms Mexico's economy and made daily life economically precarious for many Mexicans. Conversely, California received increased flows of Central American immigrants, fleeing the violence of civil wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, and other Cold War proxy armed conflicts in the region. The increase of a Latinx population in Southern California takes place during the 1990s recession and heightened racial tensions in Los Angeles, with ongoing cases of police brutality, which in 1992 produced the Los Angeles crisis, or the LA riots, that derive from the beating of a black motorist, Rodney King, and detonates one of the most destructive social eruptions in American history. So the heightened economic, racial, and demographic tensions will result in a relentless anti-immigrant social and political backlash in the form of Proposition 187 that was, while race neutral, targeted for this emerging Latinx demographic. Prop 187 was an electoral initiative embraced and championed by the then governor of California, Pete Wilson. Prop 187 sought to deny any public services to undocumented immigrants, and this would have had affected thousands of people, and also people that these Latino immigrants or US-born Latinx knew in their communities. So this initiative, in conjunction to other so-called racial propositions, were put in the ballot and actually approved by California voters in the mid-1990s, which sought to perpetuate a white political dominance on the emerging non-white population, which was a decisively Latinx majority. So it is in this social, economic, racial, and political moment that through cultural expressions, Rock Angelino participants claim themselves as part of Southern California, and also push against anti-immigrant rhetoric of the 1990s, while also advocating for equality and social justice in the US and greater democracy in Latin America. So the cultural production generated by Rock Angelino participants through these magazines, it's a new point of intervention in our current historical research focusing on the 1990s and early 20th century California. As a cultural history, my work enables us to consider the continuous connections between Latinx communities in the US and Latin America, and also how these circuits of cultural exchange create and expand on printed cultures in which Latinx and in the US connect to contemporary culture and politics through the writers or as readers of these publications. Now, as a case study of this printed culture, I want to discuss the opposition or countercultural do-it-yourself publications that emerged in 1990 Southern California, such as La Neta, La Banda Elástica, and El Borde. These publications drew from intellectual lineages of the Mexican and Latin American opposition of culture and politics, and also the intellectual scenes of these different countries in Latin America. So in the 1980s, Latin American literary movements such as Shanghai in Argentina, Mac Ondo in Chile, and also Crack in Mexico. Taken together, these literary movements sought to develop a language, a style, and a narrative mode that could better describe the Latin American urban experience, the nuance of the social fabric in this Latin American metropolis, and also the common threads of life in a globalized world as Latin Americans. In addition, the writers of these publications drew on artistic traditions such as La Nueva Canción and La Movida. Originating from Chile, La Nueva Canción developed as a political committed music genre that became popular with audiences throughout Latin America to protest the military dictatorship in Chile and in Argentina in the 1970s. For La Movida in Spain, it was a cultural reawakening after the Franco dictatorship, that it really replenishes and revitalizes the arts in Spain. So the cultural producers who coalesced around these literary and artistic movements were often part of the same circles as the band members from emerging rock and Espanol acts in Latin American metropolises such as Buenos Aires, Santiago de Chile, or Mexico City. In the case of Mexico City, we can see on the left the cover of La Postmoderna, a magazine that emanates from the artistic and intellectual circles in Mexico City. And we can see this is the inaugural cover for 1989. And there's the band, the Mexican rock band Maldita Vecindad, on the cover of this magazine that also included essays on art and literary essays. So many immigrants who arrived in Los Angeles in the 1990s and early 1980s and the early 1990s drew from these literary and artistic movements. A case in point is La Banda Elástica, the other magazine on your right, which it's published in Los Angeles in 1992. It starts to be published in Los Angeles in 1992. And these are cultural productions that draw from these earlier Latin American movements, and uses these Latin American literary and artistic movements as an intellectual toolbox to make sense of their new environment in Los Angeles and in the US, to remain connected to the cultural expressions of their own Latin American countries. So while the issues of these magazines were placed in a few music stores and bookstores that cater to Latina audience, the main point of distributions for these publications were hand in hand in rock angelino music shows, which is similar to the way La Postmoderna will also be published. When it was published and distributed, it was at artistic shows or music shows in Mexico City. So I'll start talking about La Neta. La Neta magazine began to be published in 1994, and as you can see by its aesthetic, it is in the mode of zines circulated in Mexico City working class neighborhoods that are at the periphery of Mexico City and are often derided as slums. La Neta was purposely designed using crude copy and paste text, this to signify its working class identity. Founded and mostly written by Sergio Lavis Peralta, La Neta, which is actually the street slang for the truth, often centered on rock urbano bands. This subgenre and its followers understood themselves as decisively working class. In their writings in La Neta, they connected their own experiences of living in Mexico City slums to their positionality then as immigrants living in poor neighborhoods, defined as ghettos in Southern California. In La Neta, we can also see this anti-187 literature. So this is a flyer likely circulated in marches or pro-immigrant rights actions that is then copy and paste on the pages of La Neta. It is in the October 94 issue, a month before the November election when Prop 187 was placed on the ballot, thus demonstrating La Neta firm pro-advocacy in its pages. And this next to an ad to join the El Tri fan club, El Tri being one of the most known bands for this proletarian rock and roll genre. On the other hand, La Banda Elástica aimed to be a much more polished aesthetically publication than La Neta. While some of the zines, such as La Neta, had small runs of perhaps a few hundred copies, publications like La Banda Elástica started also as zines or photocopies versions in 4 pages at its beginning in 1991 and 92, with a circulation perhaps of 100 or 200 copies. But La Banda Elástica went on to transform into a full-color, glossy publication. The magazine was co-founded by a group of enterprising Latin American rock critics and led by graphic designer and editor Emilio Morales, who really creates the aesthetic and the editorial line of the magazine, along with photographer Maria Madrigal, that also provides the visual aesthetics for the magazine and for the genre in a lot of ways, the rock and angelino genre. Some of the early rock critics that headed the publication were Enrique Blanc, Octavio Diz Hernandez, Enrique Blanc from Guadalajara, Mexico, Octavio from Tijuana, as well as Enrique Lopetegui from Uruguay. These, among many other Latin American writers who were either living in Los Angeles at the time or were corresponding as correspondents of the magazine in Latin America. By the second half of the 1990s, La Banda Elástica became one of the most renowned rock en español magazines, not just in the US, but in Latin America as well. At its height, La Banda Elástica boasted of a circulation of 20,000 copies, so it goes from a few hundred issues in the early 90s to over 20,000 copies, which by 1999 were distributed in the United States as well as in Latin America. Now, in its pages, La Banda Elástica feature interviews by Latin American bands and also US-based outfits, album reviews, and mostly music and fashion articles. But La Banda Elástica also featured fiction pieces, satirical cartoons, and day-in-the-life chronicle, especially at the beginning of its run, of youth immigrants, which were written by Rock Angelino participants. For instance, Fernando Ramirez, the singer for Rock Angelino band María Fatal, wrote several articles in the publication in which he sought to counter nativist stereotypes. In one article for La Banda Elástica printed in 1993, Ramirez gives an overview of the historical contributions that immigrants have made to the US. This to push back against immigrants' tropes that were being discussed in the media, and according to him, even espoused by US-born Latinx. And here I quote, "When we hear a prejudiced person that has been born here and say, we immigrants just came to steal jobs, to take part of social disturbances, to loot, to sell drugs, or to live off welfare, it fills us with rage and impotence. Let me tell you that we did not come to live off welfare. This is because even if we're illegal, we have dignity, we have pride, we prefer to work. And if there's no work, we invent ourselves labor to survive." Ramirez ends with an admonishing call for people who are racist against immigrants. Before saying this type of nonsense, go read a history book. Once you find out what we have done for the country, you would eat your words and you will tolerate us for what we all are, human beings. These lines by Ramirez sought to push back against this vilification of immigrants after the 1992 riots, and also against the anti-immigrant rhetoric that was increasing in California at the time. In addition, La Banda Elástica featured a section titled Voces en Silencio, or Voices in Silence, centered on playing songs of emerging LA bands, and also featured poems and verses that many times address the contributors' experiences as immigrants in Southern California. Many of these writings actually discuss the negative experiences that Latinos had with police agents. Yet, the articles of La Banda Elástica were not merely reserved to register the abuse of its contributors at the hands of law enforcement officers. La Banda Elástica writers also delve and share direct action strategies and also share approaches on how to deal with agents of the states. One of these was a contribution by Argentine immigrant Natalie Stwansky, who self-identified as an anarcho-punk. So an anarcho-punk is somebody who is part of a youth culture that, besides listening to fast syncopated punk, it also advocates for the end of the ward state and also a overthrow of capitalism. In La Banda Elástica, Stwansky penned an article quite detailed in 1995, and this is in the aftermath of Prop 187, that addressed what to expect when encountering police agents and how to deal with these police encounters. This particularly for those in the country without legal authorized status. The piece by Stwansky was likely informed by her coming of age at the end of the Argentinian dictatorship and in the backdrop of Argentina's dirty war, which during the period between 1976 and 1983, thousands of people were arrested, many disappeared or killed by the state forces. So every day, Argentinians had deep suspicions of dealing with the police, as they were seen as an extension of the military, as demonstrated in Stwansky's writings. So we see in the pages of La Banda Elástica how their previous experience in Latin America helps them understand and also share some direct action strategies to deal with police. Now, This print culture, while productive, vibrant in the 1990s, soon had to contend with the medium transformation by the advent of the internet at the beginning of the 21st century. The effervescence of the Latin rock angelino music scene waned after the first decade of the 21st century arrived. This due to the music genre falling out of favor in some ways, but also the advent of the internet. For instance, La Neta and La Banda Elástica continue to be published, albeit more intermittently. So instead of having weekly or monthly runs, it would become much more intermittent throughout the first years of the 20th century. This until they found the printing cost unsustainable amidst the emergence of the internet landscape. That La Banda Elástica transitioned to become an internet publication and continues active publishing articles online to this day. Al Borde, conversely, it's another publication that endured the longest as a regular print newspaper, part of this print culture. First founded by Venezuelan writer Alicia Monsalve and also Venezuelan music producer Edgar Ochoa in 1997, Al Borde merged with a larger publishing company specializing in weekly publications in Southern California. So with this business arrangement, Al Borde, a fully Spanish language magazine or newspaper in its form, gained a circulation of over 30,000 copies throughout the first decade of the 2000s. So Al Borde defined itself as a Latin alternative music publication, which in addition to music, also featured Latin American film, fashion, and other youth-related topics. However, Al Borde ended its bi-weekly print edition in 2009 and also moved its publishing online. So when examining these rock angelino publications with our longue durée historical lenses, we can consider them a part of a long lineage and legacy of self-produced publications by ethnic Mexicans or Latinas in the Southwest, albeit in a remarkably different historical and political moments. For instance, we can think of El Pueblo de Los Ángeles in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, and consider El Clamor Público, which was the first Spanish language newspaper in California, published after the American occupation. El Clamor Público was founded and published by another youth, a 19-year-old named Francisco Ramirez. In his writings, Ramirez offered counter arguments to Anglo-Saxon rule in California. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Flores Magón brothers published Regeneración, the bilingual anarchist publication produced by the Mexican Liberal Party in exile, which counted with a group of mostly youthful collaborators of different nations. For the second part of the 20th century, the La Raza magazine, which was published by a dedicated group of first-generation educated Chicanos and Chicanas. This publication became quite critical and chronicling in the 1970s Chicano movement, not only in Southern California, but throughout the American Southwest. The organic intellectuals writing on the rock angelino publications in the 1990s inscribed themselves in Los Angeles through this printed culture. In their writings, they push against how predominant culture perceived recent immigrants, just as mere workers who perhaps lack intellectual interest. Instead, they presented themselves to their readers as discerning, defiant, and resourceful cultural producers. The writers, designers, photographers, and readers around the rock angelino print culture drew on their extended Latin American intellectual roots and global immigrant solidarities to make sense of their migrant reality and to articulate their presence, belonging, and political thinking beyond nation states. These represent organizing against anti-immigrant rhetoric in California while simultaneously engaging in acts of solidarity and democratic efforts in Latin America. This historic moment could have been a period of retrenchment to hide from the anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies. However, through their writings, the rock angelino participants refused to live silently or in the shadows. Instead, they made themselves visible, and through their writings, they envision and propose a more expansive concept of solidarity and belonging in Southern California and Latin America. Thank you for your time, and these are my context. Looking forward to the conversation.